Hello everyone and welcome to my review of Dead Space 3. I am going to try and keep this video free of spoilers, but I will be showing you video clips from the game, primarily from the early parts. So if you absolutely don't want to see anything, may I suggest that you close your eyes and just listen to my mesmerizing voice. Give me your money. Give me your money. Oh, sorry, wrong video. Anywho, sorry if this review is a bit late, but I wanted to finish the game before doing it, so yeah. And the game is quite lengthy. It took its sweet time. I'm a big fan of the Dead Space series, and Dead Space 2 was, together with Dark Souls, my favorite games of 2011 pretty much. And I've been looking forward to it ever since it was announced. And now it's finally here, and yeah, unfortunately, all is not what it used to be in the once scary land of Dead Space. The game tries very hard to mimic a over-the-top Hollywood action movie. Some sections and cutscenes are just plain silly, especially so towards the end of the game. The focus has also changed from horror to more action-oriented. And I'm sure this is EA's idea to boost sales. And this is something I'm not happy about. Other people may of course disagree with me here. But that's not saying that the game completely lacks scares and horror, because it has its moments. Most of them are of the jump-in-your-face type though. There's also less focus on characters and story. Although we do get to know more about what the markers truly are, the story is told primarily via radio communication between you and your friends and enemies. But there's also cutscenes, of course. And you will also find a lot of recorded and written messages, some of which are quite interesting and tell the tales of long dead people. Works pretty much like it did in the prequels. We are also introduced to several new characters in the game, but we don't really get to know any of them very well, with the exception of John Carver, your co-op soldier buddy, whose storyline is explored in the co-op.
The age of man is at an end.
When the game starts, after the prologue, we find our protagonist Isaac Clarke all alone in his apartment on the New Horizons lunar colony. His girlfriend Ellie Langford, which he met in Dead Space 2, has left him to go rid the universe of the markers. Refusing to face his demons, Isaac remains in hiding on the moon and tries to cope with his horrifying memories of what happened on the Ishimura and on Titan Station in Dead Space 1 and 2. Now this setup feels really promising, but unfortunately we do not get to dive into the darkness of Isaac's mind, as we got to do in Dead Space 2. In fact, Isaac's state of mind isn't explored at all in the game, which is a real shame. Then all of a sudden some soldier shows up in your apartment and tells you, hey, Ellie needs your help to destroy the markers. Then truly crap starts hitting the fans, and there's quite a few fans in the game, when a radical unitologist group known as the Inner Circle unleashes the markers upon the moon colony. The markers are double helix-shaped structures that turns people into hungry, angry, and nasty-looking undead creatures called necromorphs. Something Isaac knows all about given his previous experience in the prequels.
Alright, let's go!
When I started playing the first chapter on the lunar colony, I thought, oh god, what have they done? They've turned Dead Space into a cover-based shooter where you kill human opponents instead of necromorphs. They've pulled a gearbox on us. And playing against the human soldiers is pretty lackluster, but thankfully this is just for a very short initial section of the game, and things are soon back to normal, with monsters happily chewing on my face. Or my legs rather, but more about that later. The human opponents do make a comeback later on in the game, but it's kept relatively short and actually works better there, because you get to fight them at the same time as you fight the necromorphs. Just as in the previous games, you should try and aim for the limbs of the necromorphs to kill them faster. But given the huge amount of ammo you get, and the power of fully upgraded weapons, this doesn't really feel necessary anymore. And this really diminishes the sense of suspense and the survival horror feel of the game. You can pretty much just hold the trigger, close your eyes and go nuts. I hope the higher difficulties will change this and add some challenge here. So if you are a Dead Space veteran, I do recommend you go with the hard difficulty setting. That will hopefully improve your experience. I myself played on normal, and I will definitely play on hard on my next playthrough. The controls of the game feel somewhat sluggish, a bit like the other two Dead Space games actually, but it becomes more of a frustration in Dead Space 3 as the game throws so many necromorphs at you at the same time, at least compared to the other two games. At times it almost gets ridiculous. It feels like an American football game where the entire opposing team is stomping on your head at the same time. It's also made a bit worse by the fact that some enemies will continue to come at you even if you cut their legs off. So with the huge pile of bodies at your feet, you sometimes don't know which necromorphs are dead and which are still trying to eat your feet. The necromorphs will usually spawn from air ducts, which there are a lot of in the game. Every wall and every ceiling seems to have at least one. The monster AI is quite well done, and they will sometimes jump back into the air ducts and come out through a different one, trying to flank you or to creep up behind you. Bastards. But this actually worked better in the prequels, most likely because they had less necromorphs attacking you at a time. And sometimes they will just land on top of you, and as you spin around desperately trying to find them, they will be busy humping your legs. So it's quite important to stay mobile, which is made a bit difficult by the fact that your movement is a bit sluggish, and often you get stuck on the scenery. But this is really nitpicking, and killing monsters still feels really satisfying once you get used to the controls and how Isaac handles. The game also has a few semi-on-rail sections where you have to navigate debris fields in space and similar. There's not that many of them, except towards the end, and they are fairly easy, doesn't take too long and not that frustrating, at least not on normal difficulty. They can however get frustrating in co-op mode, where if one of you screw up, you will both have to restart that section. There's quite a lot of quick-time events and, shall we call them, puzzle/minigames. Most of these are pretty easy and thankfully don't really break the pacing or frustrate you too much. And many of them seem to be there to underline the fact that Isaac is actually an engineer, surprisingly enough, considering the fact that he rather uses a gun instead of a wrench most of the time. They are fairly satisfying to play, even though they sometimes doesn't make that much sense. And unfortunately, my least favorite minigame from Dead Space 2 returns, the one where you get electrocuted when you fail. But this time around you don't take damage, and it also seems slightly easier than before, thankfully. They've also made the game a bit less linear by allowing you to tackle some missions in your own order, and there's also optional side missions that will grant you more resources. The visuals are beautiful and there is a decent amount of variation to the scenery. But to be fair, there's some backtracking going on and also some recycling of rooms and geometry, especially so later on in the game and in the optional side missions. It's no big deal, they've made a good job of it, but it can become a bit confusing at times because many rooms look similar and you can get a bit lost. But the locator function always puts you back on track. The concept design is very well done, just as expected and just as in the previous games in the series, and creates a beautiful, interesting and believable world. And this time around we get to explore a 200-year-old flotilla and an expedition site on the planet Tau Volantis, amongst other areas. It makes an interesting change to the concept design we saw in Dead Space 1 and 2. Frame rate is pretty good on my poor old PlayStation 3. It does lag a bit at times, but not too bad. At least not in my opinion, but maybe I'm not being picky enough, I don't know. And since they are so focused on action and co-op, the monsters have less polygons than in the prequels and also less detail. And I assume this is to be able to have more of them on screen at the same time. And this does make them look less, well, maybe pretty isn't the right word to use here, but they certainly do look better and more detailed in the prequels. Not that it matters that much though.
15 seconds to target.
Standing by to D-shot.
The sound design and music is very well done, just as expected pretty much, and adds a ton of atmosphere and creepiness to the game. Voice acting is really solid, just as expected. Dialogue is not, however, and gets a bit cheesy at times, especially so towards the end of the game. New in this installment of the series is a weapon crafting system and a drop-in, drop-out online co-op mode. In co-op mode you get to play as the soldier John Carver. He's also present in the single player, but only shows up in cutscenes and then always mysteriously vanishes. Much of the tension and scariness is of course lost in the co-op mode, but it is a lot of fun to murder monsters with a friend, either by inviting someone you know, or have the game select a random person for you. But I definitely recommend that you play through the game in single player mode before tackling co-op, to get as scary as possible experience. If you're into that, of course. The co-op mode would also change how puzzles works, it will increase necromorph spawns, make it more challenging, and also change some cutscenes slightly. You will also get to experience the full storyline of John Carver, and all of this adds motivation to play through the game again in co-op mode. Unfortunately, there's no team-based multiplayer as there was in Dead Space 2, which is a bit of a shame because I really enjoyed that quite a lot, even though it had its flaws. The weapon crafting was somewhat confusing to me initially, but that's probably because I'm a bit lazy. After playing for a couple of hours, it started making sense to me. You can combine a number of different weapons parts into thousands of different combinations, and you can then upgrade damage, clip size, etc. by using upgrades that you find. So if you want a line gun with a flamethrower attached to it, no problem. But to be able to do this, you do need to find weapon parts and resources, either by picking them up from lockers and such, or from fallen enemies by stomping on them. You do need to pick up a lot of resources, and this can get a bit old with the sheer number of items you find. I was afraid I was going to break the X button on my PlayStation controller, the button you use to pick things up, because there's so much stuff that I eventually just stopped caring and just pressed X as fast as I could and didn't really bother checking what I just picked up. You can actually find robots called scavenger bots that you can send out to help you gather resources automatically. And of course EA has made sure that you can also buy, with real money, DLC resource packages containing resources for weapon crafting. So you could argue that the entire crafting system is there to make money for EA. But to be fair, the scavenger bots will pick up something called ration seals that can be used to buy some of the items in the DLC store. And by the way, there's already a new gameplay DLC announced called Awakened that apparently will be focusing more on horror, so I suppose that could be interesting. But this DLC bullcrap is really starting to annoy me. But anyway, I think it will be released on the 12th of March. But yeah, EA is really milking the DLC cow here. Not really a surprise, I suppose, but still. And no, you probably can't buy Awakened with ration seals. If you can't be bothered designing your own arsenal, you can find 12 different blueprints spread throughout the game that allows you to quickly construct new weapons without having to find the parts. But you will still need to get hold of the resources though. And you can also create blueprints of your own weapon designs that you can share with friends. And there's even a weapon crafting arena where you can try different weapon designs against a never-ending horde of necromorphs. They've done a good job with the crafting and it's quite easy to get into. The resource collecting can be a bit of a chore though, especially if you decide not to buy the DLC resource packages. So I do feel a bit divided about crafting. It's certainly fun, but to be honest I didn't really use it that much, except for upgrading damage and such on the handful of weapons I used in my playthrough. But it does add some incentive to replay the game, I suppose. They have also simplified the gunplay, and there's only one type of ammo this time around, and you can now only carry 2 weapons compared to the 4 you had in Dead Space 1 and 2. Personally, I really would like to be able to carry more than 2 weapons, and I really didn't mind the different ammo types and inventory management you had to deal with in the prequels. But that's just me. Other people may of course disagree with me and think that this is a huge improvement to the game. They also seem to have improved on the enemy hit detection. In the previous games your shots would sometimes go straight through some enemy limbs. This doesn't really happen anymore, and aiming feels more accurate. Sometimes it's even overly tolerant, at least with certain weapons. Stasis that you can use to slow down enemies in certain objects is still kind of hard to aim though. Loading of areas is handled when you open doors or ride lifts and works very well. There's a minimum of waiting time between area loads. The game is also stable and pretty much bug-free. So far there's been 2 patches released, for the PS3 at least. I did have some initial problems after installing the game on release day. It would get stuck at looking for DLC, but I managed to eventually get around that and have had no problems with it since. Probably due to overwhelmed EA servers on release day. I also did run into a bug where I couldn't leave a room because the enemies that were supposed to spawn didn't, and the doors wouldn't open until they did. But it has only happened once, and all that I had to do was to restart at the last checkpoint. Other than that, it's been smooth necromorph murdering all the way. In the previous games you had save stations where you could manually save your progress. This time around we have an automated checkpoint system, which is slightly frustrating. Sometimes when you quit and restart the game, you will find yourself quite far back and have to replay to get back to where you were. It's not a huge issue, but it did annoy me a couple of times. Lengthwise the game lasted a solid 23 hours on normal difficulty, for me at least, and I did take my sweet time to explore and found most of the side missions and items. There's also at least 2 additional co-op only missions that I know of. That's not included in the 23 hours. There's no printed manual included in the packaging, only a link to an online one. So no printed manual feels kinda cheap, but then again it's really better for the environment, and it's not like anyone actually reads the manuals these days anyway. But what is included is your online passcode, which you will need to be able to play co-op online. An expected dick move by EA of course, so if you're planning on buying the game used, be prepared to have to pay for an online pass if you want to experience the co-op mode. And by the way, there's no offline split-screen co-op. So, to sum it all up, Dead Space 3 is a fun and entertaining high-quality title, but it's not what I hoped for. Too little focus on horror and too much focus on murdering necromorphs by their bucket load makes it a lesser game, in my eyes at least. If you're more into action, then of course you may disagree with me here. But compared to its prequels, I personally like Dead Space 2 better. With the co-op and the lengthy single player you get good value for your money, especially compared with many other games these days. Co-op is fun and challenging and will keep you playing. And there's also several difficulties to make the game more challenging on additional playthroughs. There's even a Dead Space Classic mode where you get to play the game using only the classic weapons from the prequels. And I can also thoroughly recommend that you check out Dead Space 1 and 2, which should be pretty cheap to pick up by now, and maybe even play them before you play Part 3. So, thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed this review and that it maybe helped you to decide whether or not to buy the game. Don't forget to do all that stuff you're supposed to do after you watched a YouTube video. I'm sure you know what I'm talking about, and I will see you in the next video. Bye.